All right. Well, without any further explanation, you can always reach out if you have more questions. I will go ahead and turn it over to Saleh, who can introduce our two speakers today. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. Can you guys hear me good? First of all, my name is Saleh. I'm a political science major at Boise State. And good morning, everyone. Today, I have the honor and pleasure to be introducing not one, but two special guests, Mr. Mike Ferguson and Mr. Ed Shepard. Mr. Mike Ferguson grew up and raised in California and received a degree in wildlife management and biology from Humboldt State University. He is an expert in wildlife management and biology. Mr. Mike had three careers in his career. First part of his career as a wildlife biologist, and his middle third as a line manager, and his last third has been in the business administration, and retired as a financial officer, chief financial officer. Mr. Mike Ferguson achieved the Lifetime Service Award in 2019 from the Public Land Foundation. He was the owner of the Ferguson Business Management Solution. It is a private consulting company from 2013 to 2019. And he worked and served with the Bureau of Land Management for 34 years and retired in 2009 as a BLM budget officer, and then was the assistant director for the business and the fiscal resources, the CFO, and retired in 2009 from the BLM. And now currently he is the director at large at the Public Lands Foundation. A little fun fact about Mr. Mike Ferguson is that he competed against John Freemuth in cross country in high school. So it's a small world, as he said it. Mr. Ed Shepard is an expert in forest management, earning degrees from Colorado State University and Washington State University. He worked and served for the Bureau of Land Management. He has 38 years of experience with the BLM. Ed Shepard retired from the Bureau of Land Management in 2012 as the state director for the states of Oregon and Washington, a position that he held since 2006. He is the president of the Public Land Foundation from 2013 and the board member of the SAF, the Society of American Foresteries, from 2014 to 2016. And also he held several elected and appointed office and committee assignments with the SAF. He also served 2 congressional fellowship with a congressman and a senator. And now he's currently the president of the Shepard and Associate and the current president of the Public Land Foundation. Thank you for joining us today, and I'm excited. I'm looking forward to hearing the talks today. It's an honor and pleasure to introduce Mr. Ferguson and Mr. Ed. And please, everyone, welcome Mr. Mike and Mr. Ed. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Saleh. So, who was John Freemuth? I hope at least some of you had a chance to meet him and work with him. And for those of you that didn't, I hope that by this point in the semester, you at least feel like you knew him. He was definitely one of a kind guy. Governor Brad Little said he had a unique way of perceiving and bringing resolution to diversity of opinion around public lands policy. And then Bruce Reichert, who's the host of Outdoor Idaho, said he could explain things in a way that everybody understood and he could see all sides of an issue. So I started thinking about what kind of traits did John have that allowed him to develop that kind of a reputation. And I think there's basically 3 things that stood out to me. The first one is relationships. John knew everybody knew John. And, you know, it was like he understood and tried to live the notion that it's a lot easier to resolve an issue around a pre-existing relationship than it is to build a relationship around solving a problem. The second thing that he did that is different than what a lot of people do is whatever the issue was, he got down and understood kind of the nitty gritty and all the nuances of what people were talking about. A lot of times people hear about an issue, they think it's a noble cause, they jump to conclusions about the right way to deal with it, but they don't really understand the mechanics of how things work. I can remember years ago, the Sierra Club was real big on absolute fire protection in forests, particularly the redwood forests in California. And look what happened this year. A lot of the redwood forests burned down. So it's that kind of thing. John was the kind of guy that got down and understood the ecology of that kind of an issue so that, you don't get into a situation where you're promoting something that might actually do more harm than good. And then the third thing that he did, and this may be one of the things that's hardest for most people to do. John could see every side, everybody's perspective, all sides of the issue. Part of that was because he understood the issue, but part of it was just who he was and working on the relationships and trying to acknowledge everybody's perspective. So when everybody listened to John, they felt like he was listening to them. And so it's kind of hard to get mad at somebody, no matter how contentious the issue is. Number one, you got a relationship with them. Number two, they know what's going on. And number three, they think what you have to say is important. And I think those things kind of in a nutshell are what allowed John to deal with really contentious issues like sage grouse, livestock grazing, national monument designation, energy independence, and that kind of thing that are normally really polarized conversations. And he could do it in a way and not make everybody mad. In fact, not make anybody mad. So seems pretty logical. Why don't more people do it? I think a lot of it has to do, it's a typical Venn diagram of the overlapping circles. Most people focus on the area where their circles don't overlap. John had a way of focusing first on the areas where the circles do overlap. It's kind of like you and I both ride motorcycles, and one of us voted for Trump and one of us voted for Biden. If we start the conversation with politics and who voted for who for president, it's going to be a completely different conversation than if we start the conversation talking about our interest in motorcycles and then move on to politics. So I hope that makes sense. But that was, in my opinion, a lot of what made John John. So now where we are today is we're about to go through a transition in the federal government, at least in the executive branch. Transitions are pretty stressful for anybody that's involved with them because there's a whole lot of policy changes and different priorities that go on. 20 years ago, we were in a similar situation in the transition between what turned out to be Clinton and Bush 2. Although I think that this time of year, we probably weren't sure yet whether it was going to be Bush or Gore. But at any rate, back in 2020, the Andrus Center and John Freemuth put together a conference, and they called it Policy After Politics. How should the next administration approach public land management in the Western states? And the idea was to come up with some recommendations and thoughts that they could give the incoming administration on how to approach their jobs. There were, 7, 8, 9 major recommendations that came out of that conference, but 3 of them really stood out to me as being really relevant today. The first one was land management agencies should be decentralized wherever feasible. And I think it's noteworthy to notice that what they said was wherever feasible. We hear a lot about local control and keep the decision making on the ground. And what they were saying was that works when it works, and you need to do it as much as possible. But they even recognized back then that there would be times where you had to step back and take a look at a bigger picture. The second one was collaborative decisions work best. And there's been a lot written, a lot of examples of collaborative decision-making processes that have worked and been successful. Emily, your dad was involved in the Trout Creek Mountains, which is one of the all-time models. And that's something I think that we've kind of gotten away from over the last several years. We don't spend as much time with collaborative decision-making as we used to. And then the third one was the political appointees running an organization need to understand a little bit about the programs, the policies, the rules that that agency operates under. I mean, makes sense, right? I mean, if you're gonna pilot a boat, you ought to know how it operates. So what, those recommendations been around a long time. What's the incoming administration going to do with them? I don't know. Time will tell. But I've seen 7 transitions since I went to work for BLM in 1975. And one of the things it just seems to happen every time is the new political appointees come in. They don't trust the career professionals because, hey, they work for the bad guys. They work for the previous administration implementing their programs, so we can't trust them. 2 or 3 years in, they start figuring out, man, these guys know what they're talking about. They know how to make things work. They're our biggest asset. And by then, their term in office is 3/4 over. Happens time and time again. I think it happens every single time. Imagine what would happen if a new secretary came in and said, hey, look, I have some marching orders from the president. Here's kind of what the priorities are. I need your help. I need you to help me figure out what things can we do that will advance the president's agenda within your realm of expertise. I think the secretary would be way more successful. We've had some pretty successful secretaries, but I think they could have done even way more, starting off with that kind of an approach. So I asked John one day, I said, this happens every single time, John. Why don't you teach these guys this in Poli-Sci 101? And he says, well, we do. The problem is we get them before they grow egos. So I don't know which one of you is going to be Secretary of Interior someday, but I hope when you do that you remember that lesson. So I'm going to let Ed talk a little bit now about some of the interactions John had with BLM over the years. And one of the things he's going to talk about is the Science Advisory Board. So as he goes through that, think about decisions that you can remember being made using John's model or not using John's model and the effect that had on the outcome. So Ed, your turn.
All right, thanks, Mike. You set the stage real well, and I wanted to just discuss some examples of what John did using the science, the hard sciences, and I call hard sciences the natural and the physical science, hydrology, forest management, rain science, wildlife biology, or whatever, as opposed to soft sciences, what you do, political science, social science, economics, things like that. And John really understands the need to have an intersection of all of those things. So BLM, it's not a research agency. Fish and Wildlife Service has a science branch. The Forest Service has a really large and outstanding research leg. But BLM has no internal research capabilities. We rely on outside sources such as, first of all, when I say we, I haven't worked for the BLM for over 8 years, but when you spend your almost entire adult life working for an agency and you have the passion for the agency and the public lands, it's hard not to call them we. So I sometimes slip back and forth between that. So just remember, I don't work for the BLM anymore, but when I call them they, it's usually because they did something screw up. But no, I've had that habit that I haven't been able to get rid of it even after 8 years. But anyway, as I was saying, we have to go to outside sources. And so we go to USGS, U.S. Geological Survey, the Forest Service, or universities for the research needs. But you just don't pick up the phone and call the university and say, I need some research. You have to first identify the problems that you have and that you want solved, what information already exists out there to solve the problem. And you need to have a plan, and that plan starts with developing a strategy. So back in the early 1990s, BLM went out started to develop a science strategy that would help with that decision making. And we knew we needed help from the outside, and Secretary Babbitt appointed a science advisory board to help the Bureau identify priorities and develop a strategy for getting them. He appointed several scientists to that board from universities. Many of them had the hard science expertise, but he also appointed a few folks from external groups. But one person he wanted on that team pretty bad was Governor Anders, the former Secretary of Interior. Well, Governor Anders accepted that appointment, but only on the condition that John Freeman could back him up. And Cecil Anders was a very busy man, and he didn't make a lot of the meetings, and John backed him up and became an integral part of that advisory board. In fact, so integral that he ended up being the chair of that board most of the time that it was in existence. And unfortunately, while it did its job, what it was chartered to do, we really enjoyed having that team together, but it kind of fell apart as some of the charters expired over the years. But as John worked with that group, it didn't take long to realize that John was absolutely the right man for the job. It's what he did for a living. He knew how to bring people together. He had worked for the Park Service for a while, so he was somewhat familiar with federal governmentese, a language that most people that aren't in the government don't understand. In fact, I think a lot of us that were in the government don't understand it. But it's good to have a little bit of that knowledge. But the main thing John had a way of speaking simply and understandably. He had a lot of common sense and he knew how to use it. One of the first steps he did in developing that strategy was they set about discussing the role of science in decision making. I wasn't there, but Lee Barco, the BLM liaison to the board, who was there for the entire time, working very closely with John. So they had quite a discussion over the role of science in decision making, and John put it very simply for me. Well, what he said is, let me simplify this for you. You have a three-legged stool. One leg is science, another is social economics, and the third is political. Our job is to consider all of those and inform the decision maker of the consequences, and let the decision maker weigh those consequences and do their job. Well, the advisory board did their job, and they developed a science strategy for BLM and identified research priorities for the 90s, but also looking into the foreseeable future. We're 25 or more years past that, and a lot of the work that they did during that time has provided the framework that's still being used by BLM today. Now it's evolved as issues have changed. It's not static, nothing is, but that framework was still being used, and well, at least it was when I retired. Well, there's a lot of examples that Mike and I could talk about probably a whole semester long about how science has been used and emphasized and de-emphasized over the years. Uh, we were in, Mike and I were both involved in a lot of those examples. A couple of them that I want to talk about just as examples. Has anybody ever heard of the Interior Columbia Basin Ecosystem Management Plan, or ICPUMP? Emily's smiling because she heard her dad was a major player in that over the years. This was a major effort. It was included several agencies: Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Service, BLM, National Marine Fisheries Service, and it included 5 states and every county within the boundaries of the Interior Columbia Basin. And I forget the number, but there were a lot. And they, of course, all brought their special interests and concerns to their community to the table. But how they started that is they had a huge assessment of all of the resources in the basin and a synthesis of the science of what they had. They established an interagency office in Walla Walla. There was an office in Boise. And it had the attention of 3 cabinet secretaries, and they don't usually get involved at that level. There was the Secretary of Interior, Agriculture, and Commerce, but it also had the attention of the President of the United States. Now, these folks did an outstanding job. They did the science team that was put together, developed the first basin-wide assessment that was ever done at that scale. They had a lot of different teams working on this, and teams included county commissioners, representatives of state agencies, some of the tribes, and the public. They worked, I don't know how many years, trying to bring this all together. But John, he often said that all science is political. And one of your readings has a High Country News article where he wrote the use of best available science, along with consideration of political, social, and economic information, results in the best informed decisions. If you don't consider the political and social and economic along with the hard sciences, decisions can't be sustainable. Well, at the end of the day, despite all the good work that those folks did and the best intentions, it never got implemented on a basin-wide scale, which is what the intent was. And another well-informed gentleman named Tip O'Neill, who was the Speaker of the House, says all politics is local. And in my opinion, what happened with the Interior Columbia Basin project was the local governments, the county commissioner, sitting in the courthouse, just couldn't feel the ownership in the decisions that were being made at that larger scale. They felt they had little say in it, and it got very controversial very quickly, and went back to Washington, D.C., which is where you don't want land management decisions to go. But after several years of trying to quell that controversy and remedy the situation, it was finally decided it was time to move on and do something else. So all politics is local, and as land managers, we missed that part of the equation. Had we broken that down into more bite-sized areas and tailored the decisions to better fit the differences between a county in western Montana and eastern Oregon, we might have been more successful. But the positive thing of that is the science that came out of that, the assessment work that was done was outstanding, and it's still being used throughout the basin, and decisions are being made using that. But unfortunately, it's not at an ecosystem scale like it was intended. It's at a local BLM office, a national forest, instead of more of an integration of the decision. Another example is one that I'm really familiar with because I worked the last part of my career in this, was revision of a resource management plan in Western Oregon. This was a court-ordered revision, and it was on a very tight deadline. And we knew it was going to be controversial, and a lot was going to depend on the science. So we used part of the science strategy that was developed to develop teams. We had a science team, and the science team was comprised of a lot of the scientists that did the original work that came out of the Northwest Forest Plans. They were the principal investigators, top level people. That we had our interagency disciplinary team, interdisciplinary team that they were assigned to work with the scientists. And of course, because all resource management plans get litigated at one time or another, we had a legal team to help us make sure that we put everything together the way it should be. Well, it really worked well. I think having the resource specialists work hand in hand with the scientists for the most part. And the scientists, at the end of the day, as we came out with the proposed draft of the resource management plans, they were asked, I think it was 4 questions, and I don't remember exactly what they were, but basically it came down to, did we get your science right? Did we, or was our analysis right using your science? And if it wasn't, what do we have to do to fix it? Well, as I said, it worked fairly well, but it wasn't perfect because we had a couple of scientists that wanted to make the decision. And they considered just their science part, their species that they specialized in. If it was a wildlife biology, for example. And they couldn't see outside of that. They didn't, and my job was to try to take all of this and put it together along with not only the science, but the input from the cooperators and the public to try to make a balanced decision. And most of the scientists understood that, but a few didn't understand that trade-offs have to be made. And that's what we do in multiple use agencies. And that's why it's so hard. And Mike and I have heard the term or phrase that multiple use management isn't for wimps. And that's just the reason for that. It's hard, and you have to balance all of those different aspects of it. So, well, there are a lot of examples of this, and for good or bad. And there's sagebrush is a prime example that's going on right now, but it's not confined to land use management. There are a lot of wicked problems in society with no easy solution. And that's one of the things that John and the advisory board emphasized, is that science is never perfect. Life goes on, and you have to make decisions without answers to all your questions. And I don't know if it was John or somebody else that said this, but it sounds like John, so I'll say it was him. Sometimes you have to design the landing gear while you're flying the airplane. And I think the perfect example of that is what we're going through right now with the pandemic. And there's going to be a lot of opportunities for graduate students in quality science, social science, to study how the science was used or not used surrounding not only decisions made in the United States, but by worldwide governments on response to the virus, and how some decision makers try to play scientists and some scientists try to play decision makers. Another contribution John made to BLM was his advocacy for public involvement, as Mike mentioned, and his involvement in public involvement in decision making. Do you know what RACs are? Resource Advisory Councils. Well, it's something that John was a big proponent for, and he saw them as a way to, what that is it's a group of people with diverse perspectives that are chartered to come together and help the agency resolve some issues. And so John was a big proponent of that. What RACs do is they help build some trust between the agencies and the public, because they're at the table and they see what's going on, they can discuss it. Well, RACs were started by Secretary Babbitt during the Clinton administration, and because they were established, it comes under a Federal Advisory Committee Act, and there's a very rigid bureaucratic process. They're viewed by some folks with a lot of skepticism because of the bureaucracy and the rigid process, statutory process they have to go through. But they're a great way to bring local folks into the decision-making process, but they do have their shortcomings in that they're so bureaucratic. Kind of an evolution out of that. RAC still exists, but an evolution out of that is the collaborative groups. And that's a more organic way, ground up way of doing things. And so it works much better. You've got some great examples there in Idaho of collaboratives that are working very well. Moving off from the science, and I want to talk a little bit before I turn it back to Mike about the reorganization that BLM has done, and they are still trying to bring it together as they come to the end of this administration. It's the last issue that PLF worked on with John, and John was very much against this from the very start. He called me when he first heard that they were planning to move headquarters from Washington, D.C. to Grand Junction, Colorado. I think we saw an article in E&E or something. And he called me and we talked for quite a while. And we had pretty much the same concerns. This is background in public policy and his experience working with the agency. Just didn't see how this was going to be working. He saw it as a dismantling of the agency and an effort to move public lands from national interest to local and regional interest. Well, if you didn't have the background that you had for classes like this, and I walked in and I said, well, BLM manages 245 million acres. They're all in the West, 12 Western states and Alaska. The decisions should be made in the West with people in the West. Washington, D.C. shouldn't be making decisions for the folks in the West. You don't, inside the Beltway, they don't know what goes on in the West, what the conditions are in the West. So if I said that to you, you'd probably agree. Yep, let's move it to Grand Junction, Colorado. It all sounds good, except for 97% of the employees were already located in the West. They were located in 120 offices that are scattered around in the communities where BLM lands are, and the people that play and work on those lands are located. Well, they're already there. So, the argument that decisions should be made in the West really come down to two parts. The decisions, what happens in Idaho Falls, Idaho, should be made by the field manager in Idaho Falls. Decisions that are made that involve BLM lands Idaho-wide should be made in in Boise by John Roos, the state director for BLM there. And that's how it's designed to work, and it's worked that way for decades. Where local decisions are made locally, but there are national decisions that have to be made. You know, these things come down from the White House, from Congress, from the Department, and there's political decisions that are more national in scope, more high level. And I say political with a capital P because, of course, politics handle all the decisions. But those decisions are going to be made in Washington. It doesn't matter if BLM's located in Washington or in Grand Junction, but what it means is that BLM will not be at the table. There will not be career staff there to inform the politicals and give them the consequences of the decision. There's an old adage that says if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. And that's really true in this case. John really devoted a lot of the last part of his life working on this, really. And he and I went back to Washington and testified against this before the House Natural Resources Committee. He wrote about it, he made presentations about it, and I don't know, you probably saw the clips where he went toe-to-toe with the acting director, Perry Penley, at the Environmental Journalists Convention in Fort Collins. Just didn't think it was a good idea, and that it was really going to have an impact on viewing our public lands as national public lands, as an asset of all of the people and not a localized asset. Well, according to some reports during the transition, there may be a move to put at least the leadership back in Washington, D.C., and we support that. That's a great idea. However, it's going to be done very carefully. If they start moving employees back, you whipsaw people that have already gone through a lot of stress and anxiety over the years. So we're hoping that they'll do some of that, but they'll do it carefully. So that I'm going to shut up and turn it back to Mike. You're on mute, Mike.
There, how's that? You know, I really like the three-legged stool analogy that Ed mentioned that John used to talk about. You know, what happens to a three-legged stool when one of the three legs is shorter than the other? It tilts, right? And what happens if one of them is ignored altogether? The whole thing tips over. And I think you could see examples of that in some of the decisions that are being made today. I wanted to talk a little bit about John's legacy and maybe just touch on it and keep it alive. You know, I think the biggest part to me of John's legacy is his teaching, both inside the classroom and outside the classroom. I don't know how many students John taught over the years, but it's a pretty big number. And a lot of them are doing very well. I mean, I only knew a fraction of the students that John taught, but I know there's at least 4 that are in the middle of successful careers in BLM in Idaho alone. There's another one who's working in the governor's office, and another one doing some environmental review for a consulting firm in Eastern Oregon, and that's not to mention Mackenzie Case, who's doing, I think, probably more than anybody else to kind of promote and further John's teaching. So that's not a bad track record. You know, that's a lot of people doing exceptionally well with what he taught them. But it wasn't just the classroom. You know, he did a lot of teaching outside the classroom too. And I wanted to mention one effort that the Public Lands Foundation sponsored called the Student Congress. And just a little brief history about how that came about. In about 2010 or 11, I was living in Colorado and working with Patty Limerick, who I think you heard from earlier in the semester, on a commemoration of the 200th anniversary of the General Land Office, which is one of the precursors of BLM. And we're talking about who can we get that has a lot of knowledge of the history of public lands, the history of natural resource management in the West. And Patty Limerick, who is historian 120%, said, we have to get John Freemuth. He's not a historian, but he knows more about issues in the West when it comes to public lands and policy making than almost anybody I know. That's quite a compliment from Patty Limerick, who, being a historian, you have to be a historian to really know the history, right? Well, even though John wasn't a historian, he knew the most about the history of the West. And so we asked him to help, and he did. And one of the things that we did that week of the conference was the first student congress. We asked about 25 students from all over the country to take a look at BLM issues, the history of BLM, the planning process, that kind of thing, and come up with some recommendations that they would like to pass on to future policymakers. And it turned out to be the hit of the whole week. And I happened to be standing next to John when the students reported out on their recommendations. And he leaned over and he said, this is why I love teaching. It is so gratifying and so fun to see these kids come out with, really understand some things, put some thought into it, come out with solutions and recommendations that we never thought of. And so he says, if you ever want to do this again, let me know. I'll be glad to help. Well, we did it 3 more times, and he helped all 3 times. He was involved in the planning and helping us identify the topics and some of the discussion materials. He provided some really top-notch students. I think he had considerably more students of his participate in the Student Congress than any other professor or any other university across the country. Again, Mackenzie was one of them. And he was also an advisor and discussion group leader, and a big part of what made the 4 student congresses we did so successful. And I think one of the indications that it worked well was BLM actually put together a work group to collate, analyze, sort through the recommendations of 4 student congresses and come up with an action plan on items that they could implement. I thought that was pretty cool. And again, a testament to today's youth. And I don't think any of that would have happened without John. One of the other things that he helped with that goes beyond his students was a scholarship program. The Public Lands Foundation gives 2 $5,000 scholarships every year to students who are interested in public land management. And when we first got started, we did not have a clue how to advertise, get the word out, attract students. And then when we did, we didn't have a clue how to work with the financial aid office on getting the scholarships awarded. We didn't want to just write them a check so they could go have a party somewhere. And so John came to the rescue, and he put us in touch with financial aid people and kind of was the go-between when we were trying to figure out how to navigate the whole university system. So that kind of brings me back to my opening question of who was John Freemuth? He was a guy who tried to look at a problem and find a solution. He was a guy who took the past to consider the present and look to the future. I don't know how much Patty Limerick talked about the Center of the American West that she runs up in Colorado, but their tagline is turning hindsight into foresight. John lived and practiced that. He, you know, it sounds great. John did it. He looked at what happened before, put it in today's context, and tried to figure out where we go from here. He's always looking for a better way. He impacted thousands of people inside the classroom and out. And one of the last conversations I had with John had to do with the biggest threats to public lands and natural resources in the West. And you may have seen this in one of the videos. But most people, when you ask them the question, what's the biggest threat to our public lands today? They'll think of things like wild horses and burros, wildfire, unchecked energy development, climate change. And John was certainly involved in all of those things. But he took a little different approach. He said, I think the biggest threat to public lands today is if the politicians keep trying to undo what the previous administration did. So his notion was the threat was coming from nobody making any progress because all they focused on was undoing what the other guy did, whether it was good, bad, or indifferent. And so his I guess push was to have people take a look at what's the issue, what's really happening, and it doesn't matter whose idea it is. If it makes sense, do it. And you know, John taught all this stuff for 27 years, and I think we made a lot of progress, but there's still a lot of work to be done. And so I think we all need to think about how do we keep John's teachings alive and going forward. And I think, Emily, this class is just a wonderful way to start that. And I think the work that you and Mackenzie are doing is a great way to continue with John's legacy. And I'd like to challenge everybody to think about what you can do personally to carry on his legacy and then make a commitment to do it. So thanks for letting me talk about my friend.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thank you, Ed. Thank you for this wonderful insight. Please join me, students, in either quietly or more loudly thanking our guests for their presentation today. Usually we have a set of questions to work off of, but I wanted to ask you guys to back up a little bit and maybe give the students an overview of the Public Lands Foundation. And then I'll ask Mackenzie to talk a little bit about her experience as a student at the Congress, and then we'll back into the student questions that way. But I think it would be useful. A lot of what you've described included your wonderful work for the BLM, and the PLF is a little bit different. And it is something that has not, independent foundations haven't factored into the class as largely as government ones. So I think it'd be useful if you guys talked a little bit about maybe the mission and the activities of the PLF for students. And then we could take a testimony from Mackenzie about the student side, and then we'll back into some students. Thanks.
Sure. That's it. Public Foundation was started about 1987 or something, wasn't it, Mike? If I remember right. By George Lee. George was a retired assistant director with BLM that had been around, and he's still with us. I don't know, he's probably in his 90s. I know he's in his 90s now. But he started this with about 15 other retired BLM folks, and you know, they just have a passion for public land management and wanted to continue to contribute even though they were no longer with the BLM. And so we formed this group. It's now grown. We're, I think, between 600 and 700 members. And of course, there's a lot more retired BLMers out there that could be members. But what we do is we try to help the BLM in public land management. Our mission is to keep public lands in public hands for the benefit of the American public and also to see that the lands are managed by professionally trained specialists. And they, over the years, we've kind of evolved from just supporting the budget for BLM and supporting them on program issues and things that they have. And sometimes we don't support them on program issues, and generally, you know, they accept that input like they would anybody else's. But for the most part, we support what they're doing. But over the years, we kind of came to the realization that, you know, Mike and I are part of a big bubble that was in BLM that came in around the time that Federal Land Policy Management Act happened in 1976. And there was a lot of people hired about that time. Emily's dad was hired about that time, and we all got to that age where we were retiring. Well, and a lot more were retiring right behind us, and we saw a big drain of expertise. And so, you know, we really need to make sure that there's people moving into this thing, and that's when we decided to start focusing on youth and bringing in that next cadre of land managers. And Student Congress came out of that. The George Lee Founder Scholarship came out of that, and doing a lot more outreach, trying to get folks to look at public land management as a career choice. Mike, do you have anything to add?
No, good job.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a useful overview. Mackenzie, if you could tell us a little bit about your experience at the student congresses.
Yeah, I think I remember which year I went. I believe it was 2013 or 2016. I feel bad, I can't remember. It seems like the years go by super fast, but I believe the topic was FLIPMA. But one, it was a great opportunity to meet other students, and there was a variety. Some of us were undergrad. I think that a lot of grad students, I think there was at least one PhD student from a variety of backgrounds. I think most of them were interested in natural resource management, but I felt like having that group of students with varied backgrounds from different universities was a good networking opportunity. I still keep in touch with a few of them. We had presentations from, you know, some fairly high up people down to the field level, the field office level, which was wonderful, is to know how people worked on the ground, because I do feel like that's an important aspect. But, you know, the policy papers don't talk a lot about the field work. And it was in Las Cruces, New Mexico, which is beautiful and great to get out in the desert. We did a little bit of volunteer work with some trail maintenance, had some field trips. And again, but it was great to see the work in action that the BLM does. And I think really the most important part was coming up with recommendations. And we got together in groups with different students. You know, it was kind of a whirlwind day of drafting and redrafting, and then we presented our recommendations at the end. And I believe they eventually made it up. They were presented to the Secretary of Interior. You know, so it was both a learning experience and an experience in feeling like you're making a difference. So if you guys are still doing it, I know COVID makes everything a little weird right now. You know, I think it's something that if we could advertise it at Boise State again, it would be wonderful.
The plan before we canceled the one for 2020 was to have it in Boise. We've been working with John on lodging arrangements with the university, possibly, and some of the different subject matter experts that we could get involved. So I think if we revive it again for 2021 or 2022, we'll probably pick up where we left off, and we'll probably be in Boise, but and focused on wildfire or fire management. It was a broader topic of fire management, not just wildfire.
Well, I can assure you there would still be support in all all different ways for that. So when you do pick up that conversation, please do include us in that. And we've had in this class a week's worth of talks on wildland fire, and I think NIFC would be a really great place to those students and student expertise into. Yeah, excellent. All right. Thank you, Mackenzie, and thank you for that explanation of the Public Lands Foundation. What questions about the role of science in policy and the work that BLM has done, and even more follow-up questions on the PLF, do students have for us this morning?
I have a question. We've been hearing a lot of rumors about who Biden's appointments might be, and there's a lot of hope for environmental protections this time around. I was hoping you could talk a bit about some of the cons to his cabinet as well. Is there any like setbacks that you're anticipating?
Setbacks in terms of maybe not the best people coming in, or setbacks in terms of challenges they face in the job?
I think a little bit of both. Maybe the latter half of just how his appointments might conflict with how the Congress is set up, or yeah.
Who knows? I think one of the things, I'm not sure how. Several of the people that are being considered on the short list for Secretary of Interior are congressmen and senators in New Mexico that have been around. I think there's 3 of them, and they've been around for a long time. And Udall's father was actually a previous Secretary of Interior, and they all seem to be really interested in not only getting back to a little more of a balanced environmental agenda, but also in dealing with the employees' morale and building an organization that can achieve what it was designed to do. The challenge, of course, is going to be, people don't like change. There's always a resistance to change. Even if you got something that people like and you change it, it turns out that they don't like it as well, and then tell them we're going to change back. They just don't like the idea of change. And so there's always going to be that kind of resistance. And I think, the other thing to me, back to the biggest threat to public policy being the tendency to just focus on undoing what the previous administration did. I think that's probably going to be the hardest thing, because there's going to be a lot of people who say, okay, not only we've got to undo it, we got to go farther the other direction. And then there's going to be people who dig in their heels and want to keep things the way they are. And so the conversation, there's going to be a lot of polarization in the conversation. And I think that's going to be one of the biggest challenges of the new secretary.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think talked about the whipsawing with employees on the relocation, but it goes beyond that. It's very often when you come in with a new administration, they would you change from one part to the other. They really want to change things, and I can understand that somewhat. You got a short time frame, but to work in, but when you change things really quickly, it really sets, not only the agency, but it sets the people that work with the agency, decisions that have been made, really sets things in a spin. And so it has to be done. Changes have to be made deliberately and with some forethought of what the consequences are.
Thank you. Interesting. Great question, Erin. What other questions are there? I will say this is one drawback of Zoom. I can usually hover behind a student and pressure them into asking, and my stare doesn't work quite so effectively through the computer. But
Either we covered it well or we put them all to sleep.
or it's the Friday before Thanksgiving break. I think it's the latter. So let me ask a question about what your ideal BLM would look like, because this has come up in some classes before, and I would be curious to hear if you were to give advice to the new Secretary of the Interior or Director of BLM, what would you advise them to do to avoid this whiplash of changing back and forth, or to envision a fully functioning BLM at its best?
You want to go first, Ed?
Well, I just did want to mention we do have some ideas that we presented to the transition team. They're on our webpage, publicland.org. But basically, we try to keep, we don't try to inundate them with a lot of paper. These people have got a lot going on. But one thing that we really are encouraging that they take a look at this reorganization, because without BLM presence back there in Washington, in the main interior building where the secretary is located, they're really going to be at a loss on how to make some of the changes they might want to make on there without having the folks that have lived this and have gone through many transitions over their careers, like the folks that were back there have. So one thing is we're really looking, we're suggesting that they bring back some of the, well, at least the key leadership to Washington as quickly as they can to help with that. And I think that's going to be really important, particularly as they try to build a team of the Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, USGS, all of the interior agencies working together. If they're not all together, it's going to be difficult. And of course, the COVID thing and the need to come together with Zoom sometimes, is useful, but a lot of times it's, I need this information. I need to talk to somebody right now, and you don't have time to set a call up. So I think it's really important that they get at least the key folks back there, and then because they have to look at a number of issues. They have to look at oil and gas, the energy dominance of this administration. The new administration probably won't want to go that way to the level, but how do you do that? How do you just don't stop when you've got leases out there, you just don't say those leases don't exist. And so I think career people would be a big help for them back there at this time.
What is the mission of BLM? How does it fit with other agencies, department, and federal government? And
it's hard to hear you, Mike. I don't know if you could come in a little closer, but.
I'm not sure what happened here.
That's better.
Okay, so one of the things that we're trying to do is focus on what is it that BLM is trying to accomplish. One of the things I think that happens with reorganizations all the time is somebody comes in and says there's some aspect of the organization that isn't working the way I want it to, so they rearrange it. And then it doesn't work any better, it creates some other problems, so they rearrange it again. And there's rarely any thought given to what are we trying to accomplish by this organizational structure. And I think that's one of the things that we're trying to focus on now, rather than do the knee-jerk, well, the last guy's decimated the Washington office, so we just need to move everybody back. Well, let's think about, what is it that the agency needs, and what's the best way to get that done? And I think if we can do that, and if people will listen and make organization decisions based on the best structure to get the job done, then maybe they'll have some success.
Actually,
Fantastic. Thank you. Go ahead, Mackenzie. Sorry.
I know, there's a lot of media attention right now on, I guess, the lack of transition, especially with like national security and the agencies involved in that. What about natural resource agencies like the BLM? What are some consequences you might see if those agencies aren't able to brief the president-elect? Seems pretty messy from the agencies we hear about, but I haven't heard much about BLM or the Department of Interior in general.
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of issues percolating out there. Like, some of the ones that most people think of in terms of the biggest threat to public lands: horses, climate change, wildfire management. That if they continue to get, if they get ignored and don't go back to the three-legged stool model, then those kinds of things. I mean, the horses are at a point now where they're on the verge of creating a total natural disaster. Wildfire is the same way, and climate change, I think we're just beginning to see the effects of. So I think those things are probably going to be just as big as COVID if the right people don't get to the policymakers. Personal opinion.
Great.
Alyssa, you had a great question about fire, following up on that comment by Mike. Would you like to ask that for us, please?
Yeah, I just am wondering about collaboration between different agencies like the Forest Service or the Park Service, just in invasive weed management and fire management. How successful do you think the BLM is in that?
I think on fire management, that's probably one of the earliest examples of interagency cooperation. You've got the National Interagency Fire Center up there in Boise. I was the deputy director up there for a while. And that, they've worked particularly with the Forest Service, but also with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and with the states through the state land commissions or the departments of land and departments of forestry across not only the West, but in the East too, because of the Forest Service being a national footprint. But I think fire management works well for the most part. There are things that could always be better, and you always are working on things like that. Invasive weed management, that's a little less history on that, but there is a council, it's interagency, where they work together on in fact, I think Interior heads that up now, that would work with all of the agencies in the states, and that probably goes back into at least the 90s where they work together, trying to come up with solutions to that. But like all of that stuff, you have to work on, and that's one of the things is you have to build those relationships. Mike mentioned that John always pushed to having relationships before the controversy hit, and these are two subjects of many where that's very, very true.
Excellent, thank you. Well, please join me once again in thanking Mike and Ed for sharing their wisdom and their insights with us this morning. We'll go ahead and stay on the line for a couple more minutes in case there are lingering questions, but students, have a wonderful break next week. You should expect some comments perhaps today. Mackenzie's made some really thorough ones on your outlines, and we'll follow up. I will send you an email after the break about the last steps for those assignments for class, reiterating what we see those expectations to be. Thank you for being with us this morning. morning. Thank you for your excellent listening and good questions here. And we have 2 more guests. So that's about it. Have a wonderful break. Don't see anybody. Don't travel anywhere. Don't do anything. Keep our hospitals empty. Bye-bye.